I spent 2 years working late shifts at a greasy diner, saving every tip for a $26,000 study trip I'd dreamed of since high school. 1 week before departure, my mom called me into the kitchen. She didn't apologize. Her voice was flat, almost bored. "Your cousin will be going instead." I thought she was joking until I saw my name erased from the passenger list. I couldn't breathe. It wasn't just the trip she took. It was every ounce of worth I had fought for. And if she thought I would just accept it, she had no idea who I was about to become. I grew up in a house where the rules were never written down, but somehow carved into the walls. My father died when I was 9, and from that moment, my mother became the sole decision-maker about the bills, the meals, even the friends I was allowed to have. She had a way of making every choice sound final, like there was no other reasonable path but hers. By the time I was 20, a sophomore in college, I had learned to navigate her moods like a weather pattern, predictable in its storms. And yet, the storms never seemed to touch my cousin. Tyler was the golden boy, the one who could skip family dinners without consequence, whose birthday parties had catered food and shiny envelopes from relatives. Mine were simpler, cake from a box mix and maybe a sweater if Mom was in the mood. He got a laptop for graduating high school. I got a hug and well, that's what you're supposed to do. It wasn't that I didn't love him. It was that the scales were so obviously tilted, and no one bothered to hide it. One memory always stuck with me. I was 10, clutching my math test in both hands. 9 out of 10. The best score in class. I ran into the kitchen, breathless with pride. Mom looked up from her coffee and asked, "What did Tyler get?" The paper in my hand felt suddenly heavy. I mumbled something about not knowing and slipped it into my backpack. Even then I learned, my victories didn't count unless they outshone his. Fast forward to this year. I had been accepted into a prestigious summer study program abroad. It wasn't just an academic opportunity. It was my escape. I worked 2 jobs for almost 2 years, one at the campus library, another waitressing nights, to cover the $26,000 cost myself. No loans, no help from Mom. I thought paying my own way would make it undeniable that I had earned it. One Tuesday afternoon, I came home from class to the sound of Mom's voice drifting from the living room. She was on the phone speaking in that hushed but not hushed tone she used when she didn't want me to hear but didn't care enough to hide it. "Yes, it's all set," she said. "I'll just have her name removed and put Tyler's in. The school won't make a fuss." For a second, I thought I'd misheard. My name removed? I froze in the hallway, my backpack still slung over one shoulder, my heart thudding in my ears. "She'll get over it," Mom continued almost casually. "He needs this more. She'll have other chances." I couldn't move. The words burrowed under my skin like splinters. That night, I lay awake piecing things together. Mom had always believed that investing in a man was a surer bet than in a woman. She used to joke, half-joke really, about how daughters eventually marry out and sons carry on the name. Tyler wasn't even her son, but he might as well have been. The next day, a slip of conversation from months ago surfaced in my mind. My aunt, Tyler's mom, had been in our kitchen, her voice low but tense. I'd caught the words loan and favor before Mom shushed her. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it. Now it painted a different picture. I decided to dig. It didn't take long. Our town's small enough that whispers travel fast. An old family friend, after enough prodding, admitted that Mom had taken money from my aunt last year. A big chunk. Enough to cover some home repairs and apparently buy Tyler a spot in whatever opportunity he wanted. In return, Mom had promised to help give him a future. My trip was the perfect currency. I sat at my desk staring at my laptop screen, my hands hovering over the keyboard. If you were in my shoes, would you confront her, or keep pretending you didn't know? I clicked open my email and searched for messages from the program coordinator. The most recent one was from that morning. "Dear Haley," it began, "as per your mother's request, your registration for the Summer Study Abroad program has been cancelled. We have updated our roster to include Tyler W. in your place. Please let us know if this change is in error." My throat went dry. They had even spelled his last name out in full, like it was final, official, irreversible. I read it again and again, each time feeling the words etch deeper into me. I didn't reply. Not yet. I just sat there, the cursor blinking back at me, as if it were waiting for me to decide whether I was going to be the kind of person who swallowed this quietly, or the kind who finally said no. The day after I read that email, I did what I'd always done when something hurt too much to process. I worked. I picked up extra shifts at the diner, stayed longer at the library desk. If I kept moving, maybe I could outrun the humiliation pressing against my ribs. My professors noticed my effort. By mid-semester, I was ranked in the top 5 students in my year. On weekends, I volunteered at a local literacy program, teaching kids to read. I told myself that if I kept stacking my life with achievements, Mom would have no choice but to see me. But visibility is a strange thing. Sometimes it's not about how brightly you shine. It's about whether someone is willing to look. Mom didn't. At least, not at me. One afternoon between classes, I ducked into a quiet cafe. It was raining outside, the kind of steady drizzle that smudges the city into soft grays. I sat by the window with a lukewarm latte, scrolling through my phone. A notification popped up from the family group chat. "Proud of you, Tyler. Off to see the world." The message was from my aunt, accompanied by a photo of Tyler posing with his new luggage, grinning like a kid on Christmas. The thread filled with heart emojis and cheers from relatives. My name never came up. My thumb hovered over the keyboard, itching to type something, anything. But I set the phone down instead. I stared out at the rain, the glass fogging with my breath. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly. It was the realization that I could empty myself completely, of time, energy, money, and still be invisible in my own family. A week later, I finally brought up the trip to Mom. My voice was steady, but inside I was bracing for impact. "Why didn't you tell me you'd given my spot to Tyler?" She didn't even look up from her phone. "Don't be dramatic." 4 words, clipped and dismissive, like she was swatting away a gnat. That was when the ache turned into something else. Not quite rage. Rage would have been too loud. This was quieter, heavier. A knowing that nothing I did would tip the scales in my favor. The late nights started catching up to me. My body felt leaden, my thoughts scattered. I forgot appointments, misplaced assignments. Sometimes I woke in the dark, heart pounding, unsure if I was dreaming or remembering something real. The mirror showed a pale, hollowed-out version of me. Friends invited me to movie nights, study groups, weekend hikes. I declined every time. The idea of being around people who might ask questions I didn't want to answer, was exhausting. I told myself I was just busy, but really, I was retreating. Then came the second blow. I was helping my friend Claire set up for a fundraiser when my cousin Mark, the family's unofficial gossip hub, dropped by. We chatted idly until he leaned in and lowered his voice. "You know," he said, "your mom planned to give Tyler that spot months ago. Like 6 months ago. She was talking about it at Thanksgiving. The words landed like cold water down my back. 6 months ago. Before I'd even submitted my final payment. Before the program had even confirmed my attendance. All that time, she'd let me believe the trip was mine. Let me work myself raw, knowing she'd already decided otherwise. I laughed, but it wasn't from humor. It was the brittle, hollow kind that makes people glance away. "Thanks for telling me," I said, and Mark nodded like he'd done me a favor. Maybe he had. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, tracing the cracks in the paint with my eyes. I could feel the edges of myself wearing thin, like I might vanish, if I kept living on her terms. Somewhere between midnight and morning, a thought settled in. I needed to find something she couldn't take from me, an opportunity she couldn't sign away with a phone call, something entirely mine. I didn't know what it would be yet, but I knew I was done playing the game by her rules. The search started small. I spent hours in the campus library, scrolling through scholarship boards and exchange program listings, looking for something, anything, that could pull me out of my orbit at home. Most of them required partial funding or recommendations I didn't have. I was about to close my laptop when a headline caught my eye. Full scholarship, European academic exchange, all expenses covered. It felt too perfect to be real. A year of studying in Europe, travel stipends, living expenses, everything paid for. I bookmarked it but didn't apply right away. My first instinct was that I wasn't good enough. Programs like this were for people with spotless transcripts, fluent languages, glossy resumes. I had good grades, sure, but I was also a girl who spent nights pouring coffee for strangers to make ends meet. A week later, I mentioned it to Dr. Harris, my academic advisor. She leaned back in her chair, her sharp eyes studying me like she could see straight through my self-doubt. "Apply," she said simply. "You're exactly the kind of student they're looking for. Driven, resilient, resourceful. Don't let the voice in your head tell you otherwise." Her certainty was contagious. That night, I printed the application requirements and spread them across my desk. Essays, transcripts, letters of recommendation. It looked daunting, but for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of something that wasn't exhaustion. It was possibility. The nights became my workshop. I drafted my personal essay in the quiet hours when the dorm was still. My fingers trembled over the keyboard, not from the cold, but from the weight of what I was trying to say. I wrote about loss, about building a life with my own hands, about the invisible battles fought in kitchens and phone calls. I didn't mention Tyler or my mother by name, but the shadow of them was in every line. Somewhere around 2 a.m., I stopped to sip cold tea and looked at the blinking cursor. I thought of all the times I'd been told I wasn't enough, and I typed one final sentence that felt like a vow. I am not asking for permission to grow. Weeks passed, then one Thursday morning, I opened my inbox and saw it. The subject line that made my breath catch. "Congratulations, you've been selected." My heart raced as I read the details. I'd been awarded the full scholarship. The program would start in June, the exact same month Tyler was scheduled for his trip. I laughed out loud, not from spite, but from sheer disbelief. Without meaning to, I'd carved my own path right alongside his, and this one didn't have my mother's fingerprints anywhere on it. The first thing I did was secure my independence. I found a small studio apartment close to campus for the months before departure. It was barely big enough for a bed and a desk, but it was mine. I opened a new bank account in my name alone, moving every dollar I'd saved into it. For the first time, I could feel the threads tying me to her start to loosen. Then, one evening, my phone buzzed with a text from Tyler. "Can we talk?" In person? We met at a quiet park a few blocks from my apartment. He looked uncomfortable, his usual easy grin replaced with something heavier. "I didn't want to take your spot," he said quickly. "Mom and your mom, they pushed it, said it was already decided." I didn't know how to say no. I studied him, unsure what to believe. Would you believe him? Or think it's just guilt talking? He went on about feeling trapped, about wanting different things, but the words felt slippery. Part of me wanted to hate him. Another part recognized the same strings pulling at us both. We parted without a resolution, just an awkward half-hug. That night, lying in bed, I realized I didn't need to decide whether to forgive him right away. My future didn't depend on his truth. 2 days later, I got my chance to draw a new line in the sand. Mom had invited the family over for a dinner before Tyler's departure. The table would be full, the conversation loud, and I decided it was the perfect moment to let them know I wasn't staying behind after all. I could already imagine the way the room would go still, the way her face would freeze. The dining room was already crowded when I arrived, the air thick with the scent of roasted chicken and my aunt's perfume. Tyler sat at the far end, fidgeting with his water glass, avoiding my eyes. Mom moved between the kitchen and the table, smiling for everyone, except me. I waited until the plates were full, and the first round of conversation began to die down. My fork hovered over my food as I cleared my throat. "I have some news," I said. Heads turned. "I'll be leaving in June, too. I've been awarded a full scholarship to study in Europe." The room went still, the kind of stillness that hums in your ears. Mom's smile froze, her knuckles tightening around the serving spoon. "Excuse me," she said, her voice a pitch lower than usual. "I applied months ago," I continued. "All expenses covered. I leave the same week Tyler does." A murmur rippled around the table. My aunt's expression darkened, but it was Mom's reaction that pulled the air out of the room. She set the spoon down with a metallic clink. "You went behind my back?" "I went for something you couldn't take away from me," I said. The words were sharper than I'd planned, but I didn't pull them back. "For years I've watched you give him what you wouldn't give me. Opportunities, praise, even my own spot on that trip. You've made it clear who matters more." The clatter of silverware stopped. The only sound was the ticking clock in the hallway. My hands were steady, but my pulse was loud in my head. "You're being ridiculous," she said finally. "Everything I've done has been for this family. For Tyler, you mean?" My voice was calm, but every syllable was weighted. "Do you even hear yourself? You didn't just take a trip from me. You taught me that I don't matter to you unless it benefits him." A long pause stretched across the table. No one moved. The tension was so thick I could feel it pressing against my skin. In the silence, the faint scrape of a knife against a plate sounded almost violent. Mom leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. "Fine," she said, each word clipped. "From now on, you take care of yourself. Don't expect me to help." It landed like a closing door. But instead of fear, I felt something almost like relief. The next morning, I woke to a to-do list longer than I'd ever faced. Apply for my visa, book my flights, arrange housing abroad, and cover any expenses the scholarship didn't include. Without Mom's financial safety net, every detail was on me. Dr. Harris was the first to step in, connecting me with alumni who'd been through the program. Friends pooled their resources. One lent me luggage, another offered to help with travel insurance. Even my boss at the diner let me take on extra shifts to pad my savings. For the first time, my support system didn't hinge on my family's approval. I buried myself in preparations, barely noticing as June crept closer. Then, one evening, Claire texted me a link to an Instagram story. Did you see this?" I clicked. There was Tyler, standing in what looked like an airport terminal, his suitcase beside him. The caption read, "Heading home early. Not for me." My stomach flipped. I hadn't heard a word about this. No phone call. No mention from Mom. When I messaged him, he didn't respond. It hit me then. She hadn't told me on purpose. Maybe to keep me from feeling vindicated, maybe just to keep the illusion intact. Either way, the truth had slipped through the cracks, and I'd found it in the most modern way possible. A disappearing 15-second video. I stared at the screen, my reflection faint over the image of his face. If she thought silence could still control the narrative, she was wrong. Paris didn't feel real at first. The city unfolded in layers. Cobblestone streets, cafes spilling light into the evening, the hum of voices in languages I barely understood. I arrived jet-lagged and carrying more than luggage. There was the weight of the past months, the sting of my mother's final words at that dinner table. But here, across an ocean, those words began to lose their grip. The first week, I stumbled through conversations with my host family, getting lost on the metro, and ordering the wrong things in cafes. I met other students from Italy, Japan, Kenya, people who didn't know me as the girl who lost her spot to her cousin. They knew me only as Haley, an American student with a curious mind and an awkward laugh. One afternoon I sat beside the Seine with a notebook balanced on my knees. The water moved slow and steady, catching pieces of sunlight. I wrote about the trip so far, the people I'd met, the parts of myself I'd been too afraid to see before. Somewhere between sentences, it hit me. I wasn't afraid of disappointing my mother anymore. The idea of her approval had stopped being my compass. I was finally steering on my own. Classes filled my weekdays, and weekends were for exploring, museums, markets, hidden bookstores. My confidence grew, not because everything went smoothly, but because I learned I could recover when it didn't. When I missed a train, I found another route. When I bombed a presentation in French, I tried again the next week. Each small failure felt less like proof of my inadequacy and more like a stepping stone. Then one evening, I checked my email and froze. The subject line read, "I owe you an apology." It was from Tyler. His message was longer than I expected. He admitted he hadn't wanted my spot, that he'd been pressured into it. Then came the twist I didn't see coming. He said my aunt had lent Mom a significant sum last year to cover a debt I didn't know existed. The condition? That Tyler be given a life-changing opportunity. My trip was simply the easiest one to trade. Reading it was like feeling a locked door click open. I wasn't imagining the betrayal. It had been engineered, wrapped in financial obligation. And while it didn't excuse my mother's choices, it made the puzzle clearer. I didn't reply right away. I closed the laptop, leaned back in my chair, and listened to the city outside my window. For the first time, I realized I could hold the truth without letting it burn me. As the months passed, I began sharing my story in small ways. First in late-night conversations with friends, then at a panel for international students. I didn't name names, but I spoke about favoritism, about finding autonomy, about the courage to seek your own worth. To my surprise, people leaned in. Afterward, students would tell me about their own families, their own battles for recognition. That connection was addictive, not because it made me feel important, but because it proved I wasn't alone. By the end of the semester, I'd set boundaries for my return. I would keep in touch with my family, but on my terms. Calls when I wanted, visits when I chose. No more giving away pieces of my life to keep the peace. I wasn't shutting them out. I was protecting what I'd fought to build. One night, just before bed, I checked my inbox again. This time, the subject line made my heart skip. Keynote invitation. Student Leadership Conference, USA. They wanted me to speak about resilience and self-advocacy to a room full of college students from across the country. I sat back, smiling at the irony. The same voice that had once been dismissed at my own dinner table was now being asked to fill an auditorium. Coming back to the US felt different this time. The airport smelled faintly of coffee and jet fuel. But instead of the heaviness I used to carry home, there was a steady hum of anticipation in my chest. 2 weeks later, I stood behind a podium at the Student Leadership Conference, looking out at rows of faces, some eager, some skeptical, all waiting. I spoke about resilience, about the slow work of building a life on your own terms. I told them that self-worth isn't handed to you. You have to claim it, sometimes in the face of people you love. When I stepped off the stage, the applause felt like a tide rising to meet me. Later that afternoon, I was called back to accept a new scholarship for graduate studies, something I hadn't even dared to imagine a year ago. My mother came to the event. She sat in the third row, not clapping louder than anyone else, but not silent either. Afterward, she told me, "You spoke well." It wasn't an apology, but it was more than I'd expected. Over the next few weeks, she called a little more often, asked about my classes, even sent me an article she thought I'd like. The gap between us was still there, but it didn't feel like a chasm anymore. More like a bridge under construction. One evening, I visited home. The house smelled the same, lavender cleaner and the faint scent of coffee. But it felt smaller somehow. I stepped out onto the front porch after dinner, leaning against the railing. Through the kitchen window, I watched my mother rinsing dishes, her profile lit by the warm overhead light. I thought of all the times I'd stood here as a teenager, wishing she could see me. Now I realized she might be trying, in her own uneven way. My phone buzzed in my pocket, breaking the moment. An unfamiliar number flashed on the screen. When I answered, a woman's voice introduced herself as a program director for an international nonprofit. "We're launching a leadership initiative in Southeast Asia," she said. "We'd like you to join us for a year as a mentor and speaker." I promised to think about it, though my pulse was already racing with the answer I wanted to give. In the weeks that followed, I started mapping my future. Not the one my family had pictured for me, but the one I chose. I envisioned an independent career, a network of students I could support, and programs that could change the narrative for others who'd grown up under the shadow of favoritism. Then came the email I didn't expect, from Tyler. "I heard about your nonprofit project. Any chance I could help?" He didn't elaborate, and I wasn't sure if it was guilt, genuine interest, or a mix of both. But I decided to say yes, not because I'd forgotten the past, but because moving forward sometimes meant letting someone else try again. By late summer, I was packing again. This time there was no secrecy, no fear of someone erasing my name from a list. My ticket was booked to Bangkok, my visa approved, my plans set. At the airport, I stood with my carry-on in one hand, my passport in the other, watching planes rise into a sky the color of early dawn. I wasn't running away anymore. I was stepping into something entirely mine.